The morning sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting a golden glow on the meticulously decorated room. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen, where a woman stood, elegantly dressed, carefully stirring her drink. She took slow, deliberate sips, her gaze shifting between the clock and the hallway leading to the bedroom. Her husband, still in bed, had yet to get up, a habit that had become far too frequent in recent months. Once, she had looked at him with admiration, proud of the hardworking, dedicated man she had married. Now, as she watched him sleeping in late again, a deep sense of disappointment settled in her chest. The shift in their marriage had been slow but unmistakable. In the beginning, they had been the envy of their friends, two ambitious individuals climbing the corporate ladder side by side. He was a strategist, a planner, always thinking 10 steps ahead, while she was a woman of presence, commanding attention wherever she went. Together, they were unstoppable. But then, without warning, his company downsized, and he found himself without a job. At first, she had been supportive, reassuring him that it was only temporary. But as months dragged on, her patience wore thin. They had built their lives around the idea of success, beautiful house, luxury vacations, dinners at expensive restaurants. She had worked just as hard to maintain that lifestyle, but now, she felt as though she were carrying the burden alone. He still applied for jobs, still attended networking events, but the lack of results made her question his efforts. It didn't help that their friends whispered about his unemployment behind their backs. The more she listened to them, the more her frustration grew. And so, the admiration she once held turned into resentment, her words sharper, her patience nearly gone. That morning, when he finally woke up, she was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed, the coffee in her cup now cold. "How long are you planning to live like this?" she asked, her tone devoid of warmth. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I have another interview next week." But that wasn't enough for her. "Next week?" she scoffed. "And in the meantime? Are you just going to sit around, waiting for a miracle?" The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than any insult. He had always been the one with the plans, the one who made things happen. But now, she no longer believed in him. He remembered the day he lost his job vividly. One moment, he was sitting in a boardroom, leading a critical presentation, and the next, he was being called into an office, given a carefully worded speech about restructuring, and handed a severance package. The shock had numbed him at first. He had given the company everything: long nights, endless dedication, sacrifices. And yet, none of it mattered when it came down to the numbers on a spreadsheet. They had to cut costs, and he was just another expense to eliminate. At first, he treated it like a temporary setback. He polished his resume, reached out to his contacts, and reassured his wife that he would find something soon. But the job market was more competitive than he had anticipated. For every position he applied to, there were hundreds of equally qualified candidates. Weeks turned into months, and every rejection chipped away at his confidence. His wife's support, once unwavering, became strained. He could see the disappointment in her eyes, the growing irritation in her voice. He started taking on consulting projects to bring in some money, but they were inconsistent, never enough to match what he had earned before. The pressure weighed on him, not just financially, but emotionally. He wasn't just fighting to find a job, he was fighting to maintain his dignity, to prove to his wife, and to himself, that he was still the man he used to be. But as the months passed, her words grew harsher, her patience thinner. And he wondered if he was losing more than just a career. The first time she openly mocked him was during a dinner with friends. They had been invited to a gathering at a high-end restaurant, the kind of place they used to frequent when both were thriving in their careers. The conversation was lively, filled with discussions about promotions, investments, and travel plans. When someone asked about his work, he hesitated for a moment too long. That's when his wife laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, he's on an extended vacation," she said, swirling her wine. "A very, very long one." The table erupted in laughter, but he could feel the sting behind her words. Later that night, when they were alone, he confronted her. "Why would you say that?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. She rolled her eyes. "What was I supposed to say? That you've been unemployed for months? That you're barely bringing in anything? Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me?" Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of his pride. He had known she was frustrated, but to hear her admit that he was an embarrassment, it was more than he could bear. From that moment on, everything changed. She no longer hid her resentment. It was in the way she spoke to him, the way she looked at him. When he suggested a budget adjustment, she scoffed, reminding him that she was the one paying the bills. When he stayed up late working on applications, she dismissed it as a waste of time. And when he finally received an interview opportunity, she barely reacted. It was as if she had already given up on him. The tension in their home became unbearable. Conversations turned into arguments, silence stretched between them like a vast chasm. She spent more time out with friends, coming home late, smelling of expensive perfumes and fine dining. Meanwhile, he withdrew further into himself, his days consumed with job applications and quiet desperation. She no longer looked at him with warmth. When she spoke, it was with contempt, as if he were a burden she couldn't wait to rid herself of. "Maybe you should move back in with your parents," she suggested one evening, barely looking up from her phone. The casual cruelty of her words stunned him. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice hollow. She didn't answer. That silence was all he needed to hear. That night, he made his decision. He packed a suitcase, taking only the essentials. He didn't leave a note, didn't ask for a fight. He simply walked to the door, turned one last time to look at the woman who had once loved him, and said, "One day, you'll regret this." Then, he left. She watched him go, arms crossed, unmoved by his departure. She told herself she felt relief, that she was finally free from the weight of his failures. But as the days passed, that relief never came. And when she least expected it, the regret began to creep in. He walked aimlessly through the dimly lit streets, the weight of his suitcase dragging behind him. The world outside felt indifferent, uncaring of his personal tragedy. He checked into a small, modest rental room on the outskirts of town, far from the elegant home he had shared with his wife. The space was suffocating, with its cracked walls and flickering light bulbs, but it was all he could afford now. He sat on the bed, staring at the peeling ceiling, letting the silence settle in. His phone buzzed, but it wasn't her. It never would be. She had made it clear, he was no longer her concern. He had never felt this kind of loneliness before, the kind that gnawed at his soul, whispering that maybe, just maybe, she had been right. Days blurred into each other, an endless cycle of rejection emails and sleepless nights. The once confident man who had conquered boardrooms was now ignored by employers who barely glanced at his resume. He considered taking any job, even ones beneath his expertise, but even those were scarce. The humiliation of standing in line at a job agency, surrounded by desperate faces, was suffocating. He overheard whispers, overqualified, too long without work, might not fit in anymore. Each phrase was a dagger to his pride. But the worst pain came at night when memories of his wife's mocking laughter played on repeat in his mind. She had dismissed him as a failure, and now, with every rejection, he feared she had been right all along. For the first few days after his departure, she reveled in her newfound freedom. No more tense silences, no more discussions about finances, no more watching him sit in that chair, brooding over another failed job application. She went out with friends, spent weekends at luxurious spas, and pretended nothing had changed. When people asked about him, she shrugged, painting herself as the strong, independent woman who had outgrown a useless man. "I told him to get his life together. If he couldn't, that was his problem," she'd say, and her friends nodded approvingly. The attention felt good, liberating, even. She convinced herself she had made the right choice. But at night, when the laughter faded and the lights dimmed, the house felt different. Too quiet. Too empty. She never realized how much his presence had filled the space. His side of the bed remained untouched, the indentation of where he used to sleep still visible. She tried to ignore it, but the silence gnawed at her, a stark contrast to the lively world outside. When she scrolled through social media, she saw couples traveling together, celebrating anniversaries, and it stung in a way she hadn't expected. She dismissed it as momentary nostalgia, refusing to acknowledge the hollow feeling creeping into her chest. The first whispers began at a dinner party. A mutual friend leaned in, voice dripping with curiosity. "So, he really left? Just like that?" Another chimed in, smirking, "I heard he couldn't handle the pressure. Must be embarrassing for him." She laughed, playing along, but the comments lingered long after the wine glasses were emptied. People treated her differently now, some with admiration for her strength, others with barely concealed judgment. "It's a shame," one woman muttered, just within earshot. "They were a power couple once. Now look at them." The sting was unexpected, like a slap she hadn't seen coming. She had thought his absence would be her triumph, but instead, it had become a spectacle. At work, colleagues treaded carefully around her, as if they weren't sure whether to congratulate or pity her. She overheard whispers in the break room, speculation about whether she had pushed him out or if he had abandoned her. The world she had so carefully constructed around her image now felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She told herself she didn't care, but the longer she ignored it, the louder the doubts became. Had she truly won? Or had she made the worst mistake of her life? Miles away, in a dimly lit cafe, he sat across from an old colleague, someone he hadn't seen in years. They had crossed paths by chance, and now, between sips of bitter coffee, his former coworker was offering him something he hadn't felt in months: hope. "I remember your work," the man said, tapping the table thoughtfully. "You were one of the best strategists we had. My new firm could use someone like you." The words were almost surreal, a stark contrast to the endless doors slammed in his face. But even as his heart raced, doubt crept in. Could he really start over? Was he still the man he used to be? But he had nothing left to lose. So he said yes. The position wasn't glamorous, it was a small company, nothing like the prestigious firms he had once worked for. But it was something. A start. He poured everything he had into the work, staying late, relearning the skills that had once come so easily to him. Slowly, something changed. His confidence, long buried under months of rejection and humiliation, started to return. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was rebuilding. And for the first time since he had left, he didn't think about her. Not once. His work became his obsession, his lifeline. Every project he touched thrived, and soon, whispers of his brilliance spread through the company. He wasn't just another employee, he was someone people turned to for solutions, a mind that could untangle the most complex problems. His boss took notice, and within months, he was offered a significant promotion. The salary wasn't as high as his old job, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was worth something again. He no longer walked with the burden of failure on his shoulders, he carried himself like the man he used to be. It wasn't until a company dinner that he realized just how much he had changed. Seated at a luxurious restaurant, dressed in a suit he had almost forgotten he owned, he felt like himself again. When a waiter passed by, pouring him a drink, he caught his reflection in the glass. The defeated man who had left home months ago was gone. In his place stood someone new, stronger, wiser, and finally free from the chains of the past. He didn't miss her. He didn't hate her. He simply didn't think of her anymore. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all. She sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the stack of unpaid bills that had accumulated over the past few weeks. The numbers blurred together, an overwhelming mess of red warnings and due dates she had carelessly ignored. When he had been there, she never had to worry about these things. He had handled everything, balancing expenses, planning their finances, making sure they lived comfortably. Now, the weight of it all pressed down on her, suffocating in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had assumed she could manage just fine on her own, but reality was proving her wrong. The mortgage was due, the credit card balance was higher than she remembered, and the luxury she had indulged in over the past months was starting to catch up with her. She had spent freely, celebrating her independence, but now, with no one to fall back on, every dollar mattered. She considered cutting back on some expenses, but the thought of downgrading her lifestyle made her stomach twist. How had she let things spiral like this? As she stared at the overdue notices, a bitter truth settled in. She had underestimated just how much he had done for her. At first, her social life flourished. She had thrown herself into outings, spa trips, and lavish dinners with friends, basking in their admiration for her newfound freedom. But slowly, things began to change. Invitations became less frequent, texts unanswered. She started noticing the subtle shifts in conversation, the way people spoke to her with forced smiles and polite nods. She had always believed her circle of friends would be there for her, but now, she wasn't so sure. One evening, she overheard two acquaintances whispering at a cocktail party. "She used to be someone, didn't she? Now she's just floundering." The words struck her harder than she expected. She had thought leaving him would make her stronger, more desirable, but instead, it had made her irrelevant. Without the image of a successful marriage, she was just another woman struggling to keep up. The realization was sharp and unforgiving. Her social status had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. And without him, she was slowly fading from the world she once dominated. The house felt cavernous in its emptiness. She had never noticed before how silent the evenings were, how the absence of his presence left a void that even the hum of the television couldn't fill. She had spent months convincing herself that his departure was a relief, a necessary step toward her independence. But now, as she sat alone at the dining table, the silence was deafening. The meal before her, once part of shared conversations and laughter, felt cold and unappetizing. She scrolled through her phone, hesitating over his contact. She told herself she didn't miss him, she missed the routine, the comfort of having someone there. But as the days stretched into weeks, she could no longer deny the truth. She had spent so much time focusing on what he wasn't that she had failed to appreciate what he was. He had been stability, security, and most of all, someone who had truly cared. And now, she was left with nothing but regret. Her co-workers had started treating her differently. It wasn't outright disrespect, but she noticed the change, the way conversations hushed when she entered the room, the way promotions and new projects bypassed her. She had always prided herself on being one of the most influential voices in the office, but now, she was just another employee. Without the stability of her marriage, she no longer carried the same weight. People in her industry thrived on image, and hers was no longer as pristine as it once was. It became painfully clear at a corporate event. She stood among her peers, swirling the drink in her hand as conversations flowed around her. A senior executive, someone she had once impressed, barely acknowledged her presence. Shame about what happened, someone muttered nearby. She clenched her jaw, realizing that in their eyes, she was no longer the woman who had it all, she was just another casualty of a failed marriage. The humiliation burned, but deeper than that was the painful realization that she had lost more than just a husband. She had lost the respect she once took for granted. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was better off without him, but the cracks in that illusion had begun to show. Every aspect of her life had been affected, her social standing, her finances, her career. She had thought she was gaining freedom, but instead, she had lost control. She had mocked him for his struggles, treated him as if he were disposable, and now she was beginning to see the truth. He had been the foundation that held everything together, and without him, everything was falling apart. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what might have happened if she had been more patient, more understanding. If she had supported him instead of tearing him down, would they still be together? Would he still be by her side, steady and dependable? She had pushed him away, convinced he was the problem, but now she wasn't so sure. And the worst part? It might already be too late to fix it. Meanwhile, miles away, he sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports from his growing business. What had started as a small opportunity had turned into something far greater than he had imagined. He had poured everything into his work, and now, it was paying off. He was no longer the man who had walked out of that house feeling like a failure. He was rebuilding, thriving, and for the first time in a long time, he was happy. He barely thought about her anymore. In the beginning, there had been anger, resentment, but now, there was only indifference. He had proven to himself that he was more than what she had reduced him to. He had regained his confidence, his purpose. The past no longer held power over him. And soon, she would realize just how much she had truly lost. The phone call came on a Monday morning, just as he was finalizing a major proposal. He nearly ignored it, assuming it was another routine inquiry, but something in the unfamiliar number piqued his curiosity. When he answered, the voice on the other end belonged to an old industry executive, one of the very people who had once been out of reach during his long months of unemployment. "I've been following your work," the man said. "I think we need to talk." What followed was an offer unlike any he had expected. A high-profile investor had taken an interest in his company, willing to fund an expansion that could catapult his business to a level he had never imagined. The very industry that had turned its back on him was now welcoming him back with open arms. He sat in silence after the call, absorbing the weight of it. Months ago, he had been at his lowest, discarded by the people who once respected him. Now, they were coming to him. And the best part? He no longer needed their validation. He had built this himself. The first time he returned to the business district where he had once worked, he felt a strange detachment. The towering buildings, the luxury offices, the rush of executives moving with purpose, once, this world had been everything to him. Now, it was just another setting. As he stepped into the restaurant where the meeting had been arranged, heads turned. Some of the same people who had dismissed him months ago now greeted him with polite smiles, their eyes scanning him with newfound interest. He shook hands with the investor, discussing projections and future plans, but his mind wandered for a brief moment. If his wife had been here, would she even recognize him? Would she see the man she had mocked for his failures, or would she see what he had become? The thought was fleeting, and as quickly as it came, he let it go. He had no interest in proving anything to her anymore. The only person whose approval mattered now was his own. She wasn't looking for information about him. It wasn't as if she had gone out of her way to find out what he had been up to. But fate had a cruel way of delivering reality checks, and hers came in the form of a casual conversation with an acquaintance. "Did you hear about him?" The name barely left their lips before her stomach twisted. "He's doing incredibly well now. His business is taking off. Big investors are after him." She felt her pulse quicken, her grip tightening around the glass in her hand. "Really?" she forced herself to say, keeping her tone indifferent. The person nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. "Yeah. Quite the turnaround. Guess he wasn't as helpless as people thought." She laughed lightly, as if the news meant nothing to her. But as soon as she was alone, the weight of it sank in. The man she had left behind, the one she had ridiculed and dismissed, had risen from the ashes, without her. She stared at her phone for what felt like hours, her finger hovering over his contact. It had been so long since she had last spoken to him, and now she wasn't even sure what she would say. A simple hello felt insufficient. An apology? Too little, too late. She had spent so much time believing he would always be the man she left, lost, struggling, defeated. But he wasn't. He had moved forward, while she remained stuck in the same place. Her hands trembled as she finally set the phone down. What right did she have to reach out to him now? Would he even care? Would he even answer? The thought of him looking at her name and simply choosing to ignore it sent a chill down her spine. The worst part wasn't that he had changed, it was that, for the first time, she realized she might have been the problem all along. He hadn't expected to see her again. Not here, not now. But as he stepped out of the high-rise office building, there she was, standing near the entrance, her phone in her hand, frozen in place the moment she spotted him. Time seemed to stretch between them, the months of distance reduced to a single, unbearable moment. He noticed the way her breath hitched, the way she quickly composed herself, as if trying to pretend she hadn't been affected by the sight of him. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice uncertain. "I heard about your success." He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. Gone was the man who had once sought her approval, who had once craved her validation. He didn't need it anymore. And the realization flickered in her eyes, the understanding that the man before her was no longer hers to break. She had prepared for this moment in her mind, rehearsed different ways she might reconnect, but now that she was standing in front of him, all the carefully planned words vanished. He wasn't cold, but he wasn't welcoming either. He regarded her with polite indifference, as though she were just another face in a crowd. The sting of that realization was almost unbearable. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I shouldn't have," he shook his head, cutting her off. "It doesn't matter anymore." That was the worst part. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He had simply moved on. And in that moment, she understood this wasn't about whether he could forgive her. It was about whether she could ever forgive herself. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She reached out in the following days, sending messages that went unanswered, making calls that rang without response. She tried to convince herself that she was doing this for closure, that she just wanted to talk. But deep down, she knew the truth: she wanted him back. She wanted to undo the damage she had caused, to fix what she had so carelessly thrown away. But time had stripped her of the power she once had over him. He didn't owe her a response. He didn't owe her anything. And every unanswered message was a reminder that she had let go of something she would never get back. When he finally did respond, it wasn't with words. It was with a single, undeniable action. At a networking event, where mutual acquaintances filled the room, he entered, arm in arm with another woman. He didn't see her immediately, but when their eyes finally met across the crowd, the message was clear. He had moved forward. And she? She was just another chapter in a book he had already finished reading. For the first time since he had left, she felt the full weight of what she had lost. Not just a man. Not just a marriage. But the version of herself that had once believed she was invincible. When she finally managed to catch him alone, there was no room left for pretense. "Are we really nothing to each other now?" she asked, desperation barely masked beneath her composed exterior. He studied her for a moment before responding, his voice calm, measured. "We were something once. But you made your choice." The words weren't spoken with malice, just quiet certainty. She searched his face for any trace of the man who had once loved her, who had once fought for her. But he was gone. And no matter how much she wished she could go back, she now knew some mistakes could never be undone. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she had been right to push him away, to mock his failures, to walk away from the version of him that had struggled. But as she sat alone in the cold, empty silence of her home, she realized the truth. She had built a life on arrogance, on the belief that she was somehow above struggle, above hardship. She had convinced herself that his failures defined him, never realizing that it was her own inability to stand by him that defined her. The house, once vibrant with his presence, felt lifeless. Every space, every piece of furniture, every insignificant detail reminded her of him. But it wasn't just him she missed. It was the version of herself that had once had someone who would have done anything for her. The woman who had laughed at his pain, who had belittled his struggles, now sat with the unbearable realization that she had been the villain in her own story. When she reached out again, it wasn't with a desperate plea to rekindle what was lost. Instead, it was an apology, one with no expectations, no manipulations, just raw honesty. "I was cruel to you," she admitted in her message. "I treated you unfairly. I didn't see your worth until it was too late. I don't expect anything from you, but I needed to say it." For the first time in months, she felt lighter. Days passed, and then a response came, not long, not elaborate, but enough. "I appreciate that," he wrote. "I hope you find your own happiness." It wasn't the invitation she had once hoped for. It wasn't an opening for reconciliation. But it was closure. And for the first time in a long time, she understood that she needed to build something for herself, something not based on what she had lost, but on what she could still become. She stopped waiting for a response that would never come, stopped lingering in the spaces where his memory still lingered. Instead, she threw herself into work, but not the way she had before. She no longer sought validation through titles and promotions, no longer measured her worth by the opinions of those who once admired her. She sought purpose, real purpose, whether in work, in friendships, or in the simple act of learning who she was outside of the image she had tried so hard to maintain. Time passed, and the bitterness faded. The regret never truly disappeared, but it became something different, something that no longer consumed her, but instead guided her. She learned to appreciate the past, not as a chain binding her, but as a lesson she had needed to learn. And perhaps, one day, when she looked back at this chapter of her life, she wouldn't see it as the moment she lost him, but as the moment she finally found herself. He had thought that seeing her message would bring back old wounds, but instead, it only confirmed what he had already known. He had moved on. There was no anger left, no resentment, just an understanding that some people aren't meant to stay in our lives forever, no matter how deeply they were once woven into them. He had loved her once, and in some distant, quiet way, perhaps he always would. But love wasn't enough when respect had been broken, and he had built something new, something stronger. When he saw her one last time, by chance, in a crowded city street, there was no awkwardness, no lingering pain. Just a nod of acknowledgement, a silent understanding between two people who had once meant everything to each other, but who now walked separate paths. And for the first time, he truly believed it, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Life had a way of teaching lessons in the most brutal, unforgiving ways. She had learned hers not through loss, but through understanding. She had spent so much time measuring success by external validation, by social status, by the illusion of power. But now, she knew the truth: success meant nothing without kindness, without respect, without the ability to stand by the people who mattered, even in their darkest moments. As she walked forward, no longer burdened by what she had lost, she allowed herself one final thought of him, not as the man she had left behind, but as the man who had shown her, through his resilience, what real strength looked like. And perhaps, in some quiet, unspoken way, she hoped he knew. She hoped he knew that in the end, she had learned what he had tried so hard to show her, that love isn't just about admiration and success, but about standing beside someone through their struggles. And for that, she would always be grateful.